Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Oh, like that. Wow. Oh, is it? Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know, my name is Ronald Bear. I'm the interim dean of the Brown University School of Public Health, and welcome to our annual Black History Month lecture. Every year, Brown and the School of Public Health do our very best to showcase all of the amazing contributions by some of the most influential leaders in public health. Black History Month gives us the opportunity to highlight important advancements in public health and showcase some of the amazing work that's happening both in the US and around the world. This year, I'm absolutely honored and thrilled to have Dr. Frank Richards join us. Dr. Richards is a senior advisor for River Blindness, Lymphatic Filariasis, Schistosomiasis, and Malaria programs at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia. He completed his undergraduate work at Williams College, medical school at Cornell, pediatric residency at University of Southern California. He did the Epidemic Intelligence Service at EIS, which is where I got a chance to meet and come to know him. And he also completed a pediatric infectious disease fellowship at Emory University. He spent 23 years as a CDC epidemiologist prior to joining the Carter Center. During his 15-year tenure as director, Carter Center sponsored programs assisted 11 countries to deliver more than 500 million treatments to prevent debilitating diseases such as river blindness. Dr. Richards also co-directed the center's Malaria program that helped distribute over 18 million bednets in Nigeria and Ethiopia. In 2020, he became the senior advisor to these programs. Looking to his most recent endeavors, Dr. Richards is focused on the elimination of vector-borne diseases, which you'll hear about today. Vector-borne parasitic diseases, excuse me, because he's a parasitic disease. He wants to be very deliberate about that. He didn't get pulled into HIV like everybody else during his time at CDC. But his programs have interrupted transmission of river blindness and lymphatic filariasis in parts of 4 African countries. He was chair of the WHO Malaria Elimination Oversight Committee during a time when 5 countries gained certification of elimination of malaria transmission. In addition to these impressive accomplishments, Dr. Richards also authored or co-authored over 230 publications. His many awards include the Pioneer Award from the National Medical Fellowships and the National Medical Association's Ophthalmology section in recognition of his work in river blindness. I'm personally thrilled to be introducing you to Dr. Richards and to have the opportunity to hear him speak today. And with that said, it's my absolute privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Frank Richards.
Well, I think it's good afternoon now. Thanks, Dean Albert, for that very nice introduction. And can you hear me okay? Is it all right? Is the mic okay? So here's the title of my talk, the Carter Center's work to eliminate transmission of river blindness, onchocerciasis in Africa and the Americas. But quite frankly, as I reflected on this, and the fact that this is Black History Month, and that's the dedication of this lecture, I changed around what is often sort of my canned talk, if you will, to really take the opportunity to focus on something that I haven't focused on before. Sorry, these little black things are going to be popping up. And I could, in thinking, because I've been thinking a lot about this talk, I could probably also say that this might be from Africa to the Americas and out again, because really a lot of what I'll be talking about is the effort to get river blindness out of the Americas. Sure. If you hit that X, does it go away? Forever? We'll see. Testable hypothesis. So. As any speaker ought to do, I declare no conflicts of interest and no financial interests in what I'm talking about, and I won't talk about off-label uses of medicines or devices during my presentation. And I want to acknowledge USAID, the Agency for International Development, which supports the Carter Center in a grant called Achieve Onchocerciasis Elimination in the Americas. So this is a very old paper, but one of many papers that have analyzed the DNA sequences of the parasite Onchocerca volvulus and concluded or supported the hypothesis that onchocerciasis was introduced into the New World as a result of the slave trade. So, what am I going to try and do during this lecture? I will discuss the success of 6 countries in the region of the Americas in eliminating an infection that is a relic of the Atlantic slave trade. And my angle here is primarily historical. It's African history, Black History Month. And I will especially try to relate this to societies of escaped slaves, or Maroons, that I believe were key in the establishment of onchocerciasis in the New World. So here's a picture of Leonard Parkinson, or a drawing. And he was a captain of the Maroons. And the word maroon was first recorded in English in 1666 and is taken from the French word which translates to runaway black slave, or interestingly, living on mountaintops. The Spanish originally used this word. So before I get into the Maroons, let me talk about me for a few minutes. Here I am in front of a statue in the gardens of the Carter Center of a young boy leading his blinded father with a stick. This is the iconic picture of river blindness. I'm a child of St. Louis, Missouri, and my parents, Frank and Ruth, were graduates of historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. They met and fell in love at Talladega College in Alabama, and my father is a graduate, or they're both late now, was a graduate of Howard University Medical School. This is a picture of my mother's grandma, my maternal great-grandmom, Sally Blount. She was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1867, and her parents were slaves. She was the first generation out of slavery. As we often say, ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery. And I'm very proud of the fact that she also graduated from college, probably around 1887, and I want to remind everybody that it was illegal to teach black people to read in Alabama during slavery. So not only did she learn to read when her parents couldn't, she graduated from college, so I'm really happy about that. I often went with my parents to Talladega when I was younger to class reunions. And there were a number of beautiful murals on campus there, and one which was very impressive at the Student Union was a painting by African-American artist Hale Woodruff, which he did in the 1930s, of the Amistad Rebellion, takeover of the slave ship, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. My father was a surgical resident and chief resident at Homer G. Phillips Hospital in St. Louis. And Homer G. Phillips Hospital could actually be a lecture here one day in the history of black physicians in the United States. My father, Frank Richards Sr., penned a chapter in the 2-volume set, A Century of Black Surgeons, the USA Experience, and he wrote the chapter called The Training of Black Surgeons in St. Louis, Missouri. This was a chapter on this hospital. A book came out last year in 2021 called Climbing the Ladder, Chasing the Dream, The History of Homer G. Phillips Hospital. Now, it didn't just train black physicians. It trained Hispanics, Indians, Pakistanis, Asians, and some whites during the time when residency programs were not open to people of color. And there was an enormous community in St. Louis of these folks who I met and knew growing up. As a matter of fact, I thought the salutation for a man was doctor. I didn't even know there was a Mr. Weren't very many women, but some. It's important to recognize that this hospital opened in 1937. By 1960, Homer G. Phillips had trained more black physicians and nurses than any other institution worldwide. Okay, enough of Homer Phillips. I did not go to historically black colleges or universities. I went to white colleges and universities as they opened up. And I went to Williams College, and here's a picture of me in Williams College, and I just have to give a shout out to my roommate freshman year, Jim Kingston, who came to this lecture. Thanks so much, Jim, for coming. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of me and Gerald Gant, my junior year, and we were on our way to a course offered by Professor Joe Harris. Joe was later a professor and indeed the chair of the Department of History at Howard, and he has written many books. But a couple of the books I want to point out are The African Diaspora, the spread of Africans around the world. And the course that I took when that picture was taken was Professor Harris's seminar on the African diaspora, 1974. And here's a book that I got then that I pulled off and reread for this lecture. And it's amazing. It's almost 50 years since I opened this book. It's falling apart. But it's entitled Maroon Societies, Rebel Slave Communities in the Americas. Okay, I'm going to be coming back to that book a lot in this talk. I went on to Cornell University Medical College, class of 79. And there I was influenced by Professor Benjamin Keene, a well-known name in tropical medicine. As a matter of fact, there's a clinical fellowship named after him in the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. This is the inside cover of my graduating class yearbook. And it shows Professor Keene talking and amazing, look at everybody's faces, amazing the class with his humor and his stories that basically began once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, essentially. Exotic diseases in exotic places. And what I really like about this is there I am in the audience, and it looks like he's looking right at me. So can you imagine I'm in a medical school classroom with sunglasses on and my big afro. Sign of the times. But in a book, in an article on Professor Keene, written in 1985 in the Cornell Alumni News, it's really interesting to note that what he said I could have said. When I walked out of that class, I was determined. The next 10 years of my career were mapped out. This is what I wanted to do. Parasitic diseases, overseas, international medicine, and I've lived my dream. This is what I am doing, and this is what I want to talk to you about, at least part of what I do today. So as a fourth year medical student, I spent almost half of the year, got all my electives done, and spent almost half of my year in remote parts of Bahia, Brazil. This is one of the main points of disembarkation of black slaves during the slave trade. And I could have been in Africa. The city of Salvador could have been an African city. It was very impressive. Here I did some of my first work on, thank you, Dean Aubert, parasitic diseases transmitted by vectors, which is my thing. So then I went to CDC, and here I am wearing a Commissioned Corps uniform. We are uniformed. It's a uniform service. There's not just the Surgeon General, but there are all the people under the Surgeon General of the Public Health Service. And in '87, I got married to my beautiful wife, Sherry, and we moved almost immediately to Guatemala, where I was stationed for 5 years to work on river blindness. And here's a picture of the Mayan people, who were the people most affected. Interesting, came from Africa. The Mayan people, largest group affected by river blindness in this region, in the Americas. And mainly around this beautiful lake, Lake Atitlan in central Guatemala, where I worked a lot. Here's the Medical Entomology Research and Training Unit. Entomology means study of bugs. So I had a lot of opportunities to study vectors themselves, not just humans who were infected by that. You can see another sign of the time in terms of the age of the cars. So I'm old. So the things that I worked on, river blindness, but also malaria, again, cutaneous leishmaniasis, disease called Chagas disease, and dengue. And here is my ID picture issued by the Ministry of Health of Guatemala, working as underlined in the Department of Onchocerciasis, which is onchocerciasis in Spanish, in 1989. A picture of some of the areas where I would work. I did a lot of field work. When I left CDC, I went to the Carter Center. Here's President Carter with Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And, well, we send our prayers to President Carter, who, as you know, has gone into hospice. He's been very important in this work, and I'll show a number of pictures of President Carter. But the person I learned the most about during my years at the Carter Center and at CDC is Dr. Donald Hopkins, shown here. He was my boss. Graduate of Morehouse, graduate of University of Chicago Med, pediatrician, MPH from Harvard. He is a smallpox warrior, having made his mark on eradication of smallpox and also on the eradication of guinea worm, which is a main program at the Carter Center. And he taught me the principles of disease elimination and eradication as public health strategies. So I've done a lot of work in Africa, where 99% of river blindness is. A lot of time in Nigeria, and as a matter of fact, I'm honored to be a minor chief in a small village in the Abia state in Igbo, the Igbo part of Nigeria. I was elected chief because onchocerciasis used to be terrible there, and now it's gone. But despite my work in Africa, I have a warm spot for the Americas. It's where I did my field work, it's where my first daughter was born, and being an American descendant of slavery, working on a disease that came across in the slave trade just seemed to be something special. Okay, so that's about me. The structure of my presentation, the rest of my presentation will be talking about onchocerciasis and its biology and pathology, talking about maroon communities in the Americas and how the courageous escape of Africans into the far wilderness likely played a role in the introduction of onchocerciasis into the Americas. How what we call neotropical vectors, and I'll explain that term, severely limited the extent of this introduced disease. And how mass drug administration interventions, mass drug administration programs have resulted in the near elimination, 95% of onchocerciasis from the Americas. And then I'll talk about the remote Yanomami Indians on the border between Brazil and Venezuela and the last mile of any elimination or eradication program, which is almost always the hardest. Okay, on to river blindness, and you'll see a picture of a boy leading his blinded father, which was the image in the statue on one of my first slides. It's not 99%, it's really 99.9%, given the success in the Americas and elsewhere where onchocerciasis occurred. It developed in Africa. It is an African parasite. And it caused epidemic blindness. Here's a picture taken from the 40s. In some places, 10 to 20% of adults would be blind from this condition. Now, it's a vector-transmitted disease, because that's what I'm into, and this vector breeds in rapidly flowing rivers and streams, which gives it the moniker river blindness. And it's not just any river. It needs to be clean, it needs to be clear, it needs to be bubbling, and these are streams you usually find at elevation where you have rapidly flowing rivers and streams down mountains. This is the vector that breeds in the rivers. This is the African vector, black fly, called Simulium damnosum. Now, this man has river blindness. And there are two things you'll observe. He's squinting in the bright light. That's because he has parasites in his eyes that are paralyzing the anterior segment of the eye where you have your iris that opens and closes. And then he has a lump on his head. If I were to cut that lump out, which we call nodules, and section it, you'd find a worm. If I were to stretch out this coiled worm, it would be about this long, 14 inches. The name onchocerciasis, volvulus, is turning or returning or coiled. Like in Spanish, you think of volver and vuelta. This is a section of skin that has little baby worms in it that we call microfilaria. The adult worms, which were in that section, produce microfilaria that get into the skin where they're available to the vector to pick up. Terrible skin disease, and even worse, itching. That's really the main manifestation that people talk about with this infection. But also the eye disease. And here you can see the pupil or the iris is distorted because of the infection and the inflammation around it. And this eye in the bottom is completely blind. So it is this microfilaria stage produced by the adult worms and nodules that gets into the eyes, causes disease. You see punctate keratitis, inflammation on the microfilaria, from the microfilaria, and they're picked up by the flies and then transmitted. So here's the life cycle. We've talked about the adult worms, talked about the microfilaria that get into the eyes, get into the skin, and get into the vector, and they must develop there into a new stage, metamorphosize into a third stage larvae that is inoculated again to produce adult worms. The cycle only goes in this direction. It doesn't go backwards. The microfilaria produced by the adult worms can't turn into adult worms. They don't grow up. They have to, it's like you tell adolescents, you have to go out before you, to leave the house before you reproduce. So anyway, that's a very important point, because if you cut this side of the cycle out, these adult worms don't have another way to make new worms, and they will die. They live about 10 to 14 years. Not every black fly species can support this development. It needs to be a special black fly to give the triggers for the microfilaria that are ingested to develop. In the Americas, a neotropical vector that just happened to be able to do this, because it didn't grow up with this parasite, is called Cybulium ocratium, which is actually yellow, not black. And it's in Mexico and Guatemala along the slopes of mountains and volcanoes. Now let's take this volcano and imagine we make a cross section in the volcano. So this is a cross section of the volcano. Here's the top of the volcano. Here's sea level coming down. And now these are 6 different black flies. And they all have different niches at different elevations. Only Cybulium ocratium from 1,500 to 500 meters breeding there, that's the only sweet spot where transmission can occur. Otherwise, the parasite's finished. You see what I'm saying? So this is the concept of receptivity, the ability of an ecosystem to transmit an introduced infectious agent. So if I take a look at this, another focus in Guatemala, here's a volcano, there's the 1,500 contour line, there's the 500 contour line. This is the sweet spot, that's the transmission zone, not down here. Got to go up high to have transmission. So receptivity is the presence of capable vectors that are living where onchocerciasis can be established, or capable vectors that define where onchocerciasis can be established. Transmission had to be established within the lifespan of those adult worms from the time of starting the middle passage. And this explains the limited success of onchocerciasis in the New World. Okay, now let's talk about when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus Day. in many parts of Latin America called Dia de la Raza, the day of the race, the day of the mixture to develop the mestizo or the mixed population of Spanish and indigenous and often African. It's also the Dia de la Resistencia Indígena, the day of indigenous resistance. I would also say perhaps the day of resistance of Africans in this part of the world. The day of the encounter of cultures. I would also say the day of encounter with infectious diseases. So there's something called the Columbian Exchange. When Christopher Columbus and his crew arrived, two biologically distinct worlds were brought into contact. The animal, I would have said the human animal, plant, and microbiological life of these two worlds began to mix in this process called the Columbian Exchange. These results, or the results of this exchange, recast the biology of both regions and altered the history of the world. We all know of the Great Matanza, the Great Death. 90 to 95% of the original population dying rapidly from a host of diseases, which were largely not vector-borne, but person to person. So this receptivity thing isn't an issue. If you cough on somebody up high or cough on somebody down low and you have an infectious agent, TB or something, you get the infection. So many of you have seen these kinds of maps out of Africa, the Atlantic slave trade. And I'll note a couple of things. First of all, coming from onco-endemic areas. Remember the map that I showed before. Second of all, largely going to Brazil. This isn't a very good graphic because it really should show many coastal points along in Brazil. And these two places that have very thin lines, but I propose are the main sources of river blindness in the Americas, Cartagena in Colombia and Veracruz. Back to my book. The early 1500s, black slave revolts and escapes happened as soon as Africans set foot in the Americas. So this guy named Obano in 1502, 10 years after Columbus, returned to Hispaniola because the colony was faltering, and he sailed with, quote, a few Negroes brought by their masters. Among Obano's slaves was the very first black maroon who escaped immediately to live with the Indians in the interior very soon after arriving. But look at some of these other revolts. 1522, Hispaniola. 1526, Spanish Florida. 1529, Colombia. 32, Venezuela. 37, Mexico. 38, Colombia. 42, Peru. 48, Honduras. Resistance was a part of what was happening. Don't believe this, everybody was happy. And I think it's also interesting to think of all the controversy of the 1619 project, to note that 1619 was 100 years after all of these things going on. So these revolts often led to escape into the interior, to the most inhospitable, out-of-the-way places, like in the United States, it's called the Great Dismal Swamp, had a maroon community. That's between North Carolina and Virginia. There were deep canyons in Jamaica, impenetrable jungles in Brazil, and mountains in Oaxaca, Mexico. There was remarkable courage in these escapes. Creativity, suffering, and adaptation because folks ran with the clothes on their backs. They didn't have a backpack. There were multicultural communities that were created. As a rule, there were Africans from everywhere speaking different languages. There were Creoles, and the idea that you were African but born on this side in the New World and possibly spoke Spanish or Portuguese. There were mixed races. There were quote-unquote Indians. Knowledge of white people was really important. You couldn't just get off of the boat and run away and really know what you were dealing with. And initially, onco was probably only in people recently off the boat. until the transmission cycle got started. Now, there were weeks and months of wandering to find and construct, because there were communities constructed in the right place. And these communities were under constant siege and warfare. The Portuguese and the Spanish or whoever wanted to destroy them. So skills at guerrilla warfare, booby traps, concealments of paths, and when you're close to the coast, spy systems and surveillance were very important. Capture meant torture, disfigurement, and death. So loyalty in the communities was key. And there were variable relationships with the indigenous peoples, either good or bad. And there were relationships with, speaking of the Spanish parts or the Portuguese parts, with the English privateers and pirates and smugglers. So, this is the peculiar geographic distribution of onchocerciasis in the Americas when I got started. 13 foci in 6 countries: Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Brazil. None further south, despite all of the slaves coming in, than that focus on the border with Venezuela. Let's see, is this? Okay, it's sort of blocking me here, but I do want to point out, as we said before, that Cartagena was by far the single port of slave debarkation in the Americas. 463 slave ships arrived in Cartagena between 1573 and 1640. And this was a supply of, there was no Panama Canal. This is the way slaves got to the Pacific coast. So purchasers would come up from the Pacific side to Cartagena and bring slaves down the river to, in our case, Colombia and Ecuador. Some slaves escaped, and on the Pacific side formed maroon communities. So now we'll talk about the hero of the story, the intervention, ivermectin, which is probably a common name that you recall from COVID-19, which I'm not going to discuss. As I said at the beginning. In this case, it's a hero. Ivermectin is what we call microfilaricidal drug. It kills the microfilaria stage, not the adult stage, of the parasites in the life cycle you now know so well. I want to point out that the brand name of ivermectin is Mectizan, and you may hear me using that term interchangeably when I refer to ivermectin. Despite all of the ruckus about this being a veterinary drug, it won the 2015 Nobel Prize, or its discoverers, Dr. Campbell and Emory, won the 2015 Nobel Prize in Human Medicine because of the impacts ivermectin has had, especially against lymphatic filariasis, which is elephantiasis, and river blindness. And it's been donated by Merck for river blindness, and as much as needed for as long as needed is what Merck has said since 1987. Interestingly enough, the year that I went to Guatemala with my bride to study onchocerciasis. So I got involved in this from the very beginning. Just to go back to the life cycle, ivermectin affects the microfilarial stage, somewhat affects the adult stage, but isn't lethal to that. It's not a one-dose cure at all. So the adults still live, and by affecting the microfilaria, you improve morbidity, and you can shut down the transmission cycle if you can get good enough coverage of all people who might be harboring the parasite in their skin. Many of these people are asymptomatic. The approach to using ivermectin is mass drug administration at the community level. It's not individual diagnosis, it's a community diagnosis. Is this community endemic? Do they have infected people? And then in that case, you offer treatment to everyone who is eligible. Uneligible people are children under 5 or less than 90 centimeters and pregnant women. The Carter Center assisted programs. Let me tell you a little bit about the Carter Center programs very quickly. Here's President Carter and Mrs. Carter in Chad, 1988, with Roy Vagelos. the CEO, thank you, because you met him, CEO of Merck, person who made the decision to donate ivermectin, and the Carters got involved very early in being advocates because they donated the medicine, but not the money to distribute it. The international community had to get together to figure out if they were going to take advantage of this new tool or not. The Carter Center is just one of many NGOs that have been involved in distributing ivermectin in 11 countries. We've worked in 11 countries since 1996. And that number got a little crazy there, but believe me, it's over 1/2 billion treatments cumulatively have been delivered, and we reached that milestone in 2022. So this is not just about treatment numbers going up, up, up. It's also about treatment numbers coming down. And a roadmap for stopping mass drug administration was developed by the World Health Organization. This is the cover sheet. Guidelines for stopping mass drug administration and verifying elimination of human onchocerciasis. Now, in some lectures, I can spend 10 or 15 minutes on this graphic, but I'll do this very, very quickly. It is color-coded from left to right, bad to good. Red is good, red is bad, green is good. To get it straight. So here we go. We are just starting our treatment phase, phase 1 of mass drug administration. We have a lot of worms, and we have a lot of transmission. That's ATP, the transmission potential. You give ivermectin, you kill the microfilaria, the flies stop being infected, but the worms are still there. The worms have to decline. When they get to 0, you do an assessment as to whether or not you can stop MDA. You stop MDA, you say transmission's interrupted, you do post-treatment surveillance, PTS. If you see no recrudescence, which would be all these 2 lines, that yellow line and that red line coming up again during this period, then you can declare elimination. If all foci in a country have eliminated transmission, WHO comes with an external team, verifies, and they get a letter that says, you have eliminated, congratulations, and everybody has a party. Here is the same thing with all the countries in the world that have onco. Predominantly African countries are listed. You can see the reds, and you can see it progressing to the greens. Notice that only countries in the Americas, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Guatemala have been verified or certified as having eliminated onco. And also that Brazil and Venezuela are over on the right side of the curve and doing very well. They also say that other Carter Center assisted areas in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Uganda, and Sudan are also doing well, so I'm very proud overall of what this shows. And in terms of stopping mass drug administration, in 2022, in Carter Center's assisted areas, 31 million people no longer need treatment for river blindness because of the success of what we call this miracle medicine, Mectizan. And you'll notice the tan are the people who were treated, who aren't treated anymore. It's either eliminated or they're under post-treatment surveillance, is principally in Nigeria, but if you see OEPA or in the Americas, sorry, that should overlap and say the Americas, where the bar almost looks solid tan, but it's actually 95% tan. We're still not quite there. So now I'm going to focus on only talking about river blindness in the Americas and the campaign to eliminate it. 1991, Chiapas, Mexico, the first conference, Inter-American Conference on Onchocerciasis, to discuss what can we do with this tool in the Americas. There's yours truly. And out of the discussion of these experts, the Pan American Health Organization made a resolution, Resolution 14, that we would eliminate, in partnership with the countries, this parasite from the Americas. And to do this, outside of the PAHO, but in close relationship with WHO, Pan American Health Organization, an office, the vanguard of the initiative called the Onco Elimination Program for the Americas, OEPA, was launched. OEPA and its technical office is a program of the Carter Center and has been since 1996. And here we can see President Carter and the director of the WAPER program, Dr. Mauricio Sauerbrey, at our Guatemala office where the program is based. Remembering that it was there because Guatemala had the largest number of people affected when the program started in the region. There's yours truly. So the governance of this partnership has a steering committee where all the representatives of all the partners, including the countries, sit, meets twice per year, and then once per year we have a great big meeting of everybody else to talk about progress. And I chaired that steering committee for 10 years. I just stepped down last year. Here's what a larger meeting would look like. Here's the Guatemalan certification meeting party in 2016. The president of Guatemala is there, and everyone's having a really happy time. And here's another conference where I want to point out the cross-fertilization at these meetings between African and American programs. What we were doing in the Americas really stimulated Africa to move in many countries away from just controlling the disease to trying to get rid of it and stop mass drug administration immediately, or stop mass drug administration rather than continuing it indefinitely as a control program. And you'll see amongst the flags, not just those of the Americas, but Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Uganda, which, as you've seen, have made great progress. And President Carter attended a number of the IACOs. Here he is hamming it up with the mariachis, speaking, and having someone like President Carter was essential for advocacy, for the news media wanting to know what's going on, for political support. Indeed, the presidents would want to come to the meetings, which normally they wouldn't come to because President Carter was there. Access access to donors. Going to donors and saying, why aren't you supporting this? Look at this opportunity, and therefore fundraising. We've reported the success in the Americas in terms of the deliberations of these annual Inter-American conferences on onco in reports since 1996. Now, I'm going to go now through country by country very quickly, these foci, and try and touch base briefly on the maroon experiences in these areas. Okay, so country by country, well, let me start focus by focus. 13 foci in the region, if you recall. Here are the 13 foci. And a timeline between 2001 and 2010 on the treatment coverages as a percentage of the population that's eligible by year. And you can see getting all the foci on board. The last one was in the Amazon in Venezuela to get out of red, which is bad, to green, which is at least 85% coverage. 2006 being the year we had full coverage, and then beginning to stop MDA, going into post-treatment surveillance in foci as they passed evaluations, and then ultimately reaching elimination status. Here's the same information on a bar that shows the numbers of treatments over the years. Here's the 1992 resolution by PAHO. Here's the launching of AWEPA, scaling up. Here's the year in 2006 where we had max coverage of about 850,000 treatments per year. Here it goes down, and here in the stars, representing verification of countries in 2014, 13, 14, 15, and 16. The first country to get verified is Colombia. And the only place in Colombia is the state of Cauca. Here's the report in the weekly epidemiologic record in 2013. What was the history there? The Pacific rural areas had the greatest concentration of slaves in Colombia. The slaves arrived in Cartagena and went down the rivers, there's Cartagena, down in the river of Magdalena and the Cauca rivers to reach Cauca State. Groups of African slaves and Indians went in search of gold along the rivers. Some slaves escaped and established hidden communities in these remote territories. Here's the population of one of the villages that was liberated from this parasite that probably came amongst them 400 years ago. And they look African. These are African populations in these areas. Just had to slip in a picture of me during one of our conferences, which was in Cartagena. This is the castle in Cartagena where these slaves which the slaves built, first of all, and where they were protected from Sir Francis Drake and other people who came in and tried to attack. A famous Colombian maroon, Bincos Biojo, near the mouth of that Magdalena River, near Cartagena, escaped and established a town called Palenque de San Basilio. And this Palenque was the first free African town in the Americas, and in 2005 was declared, I love this, a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. President Carter was there when Colombia received its certificate, and this is President Santos of Colombia, who was thrilled at all the Afro-Colombianos in the audience who had come from the area and spoke to them about human rights, equity, and what needed to be done to help those parts of the country which are really discriminated against. The same story almost in Ecuador. Pacific Coast, one state, Esmeralda. Here I can show a nice map of the communities in red that had the worst onchocerciasis along the Rio Cayapas. The Ecuadorians have written a book on the success of onchocerciasis, ceguera de los ríos in Ecuador, river blindness in Ecuador, which says from its discovery to its elimination. One famous Ecuadorian maroon was born in West Africa, Alfonso de Ayescos. He was a maroon leader who was the single most powerful person in Esmeralda's region. He escaped after a shipwreck in 1553, and he decided we need to take off, and he and his colleagues claimed their freedom. Let's go now to Mexico. And Mexico and Guatemala are linked, and they get really interesting. Not one focus like in Colombia and Ecuador, but three foci here. Here's Oaxaca, very close to the disembarkation of slaves at this site that I've shown you before, near Veracruz. And before the end of the slave trade, Mexico had the 6th highest slave population. And I think this is actually 200,000 is an underestimate. I've seen it higher than that. But just to give you an idea, Brazil had 5 million, Caribbean 4 million, Cuba over 1 million, and Hispaniola in the United States about 500,000 each. Now, there was a great story of another maroon right around these areas, close to Veracruz. He formed a maroon colony near the highlands of Oaxaca, which is that focus, Onco. And he couldn't be defeated. He couldn't be defeated, so the Spanish decided to agree that he could have self-rule. And in the 1800s, Mexico declared him a national hero and the first liberator of America. Oaxaca also was reached supposedly by slaves escaping from the Pacific coast. So here's Veracruz, here's the Pacific coast, here are the highlands, the mountains of Oaxaca that people were escaping to. And what we see here is a very interesting pilgrimage, not related to Maroons at all, but related to the Catholic Church, to Esquipulas in Guatemala, near Salvador, to see what's called the Black Christ. And many are postulating that the movement of onchocerciasis from Oaxaca and Veracruz followed this route. Here's a depiction of a pilgrim next to the Black Christ in Esquipulas. In Guatemala, which reached its elimination declaration in 2016, you see the continuation of this migration route. And lots of sociological discussions of religion and identity in Guatemala and the Black Christ. Very important pilgrimages that happen once a year during the peak season of black fly breeding and biting, which makes it feasible. Just had to throw in a picture of me in Guatemala when we were celebrating at the University of San Carlos, one of the oldest universities in this hemisphere, the elimination of onchocerciasis, and you'll note people on stilts, and one is dressed up like a yellow Sibulium ocratia. So here we have a discussion of the two foci in Venezuela that have been eliminated. Up in the north central focus and northeast focus, you can see the relief map on the side of the mountains, as we'd expect, but not on the coastal side where the Spanish would be, but on the other side where Maroons would be. The best information we have of all these states involved is for Miranda, which is about here, where there were a number of rebellions by slaves throughout the history of that colony, and many freed slaves found communities known in Venezuela as combes. There's some very African-looking Venezuelans in the area celebrating with drums. So here's what we have now. We have 4 countries with gold stars, and we have 11 of the 13 foci eliminated, and we're left with what we call the Yanomami focus area. Here on the border, notice that interesting border making noses between Brazil and Venezuela. And this is the famous long tail. This just goes to 2019, but we have 2020, 2021, 2022, now going to 2023, and the donors are like, are we there yet? And this is the big challenge. The other question from everything I've been telling you is how in the world did onco get in the middle of the Amazon? These folks don't look anything like a lot of the folks I've been showing you, at least in northern Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Well, out of my book, references there suggest that it was the rare Amerindian tribe in Brazil that did not come in contact with Africans. Traces of quilombos, which is the word for maroon communities in Brazil, of Negro fugitive communities have been discovered as far away as Amazonia. Maroon settlements dotted the vast map of Brazil, from the coasts to the forests of the interior, where they often merged with bands of Indians. So here's a very nice map from National Geographic, October 2022, that points out that there are 5,900 officially recognized by the government of Brazil quilombos as having originated in communities of escaped slaves. And look at the distribution there. I mean, first of all, this is my point. Why isn't there onco there? Probably not receptive. But there are also areas up here. Manaus is on the Amazon. That's in the Amazon forests. And if I zoom in on that area, here's the Yanomami focus area, and here's a maroon community. So certainly, people were getting out of Dodge as far as they could get to escape slavery. And that gives a challenge to finishing the job, because finding all these villages in this remote area is difficult. We've been using remote sensing and other approaches. And reaching the villages is expensive and difficult, as it was for the Portuguese who wanted to get rid of them, and the Spanish. And so this is the objective of the Maroons, to be hard to get to. President Carter has helped us. Here you see him with President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, we've all heard of before, asking for the Venezuelan Air Force to help in these areas. And there's a Venezuelan Air Force helicopter taking the Venezuelan Ministry of Health in to help with more than Mectizan. They distribute Mectizan, but they distribute vaccinations, treatments for malaria, diarrhea, respiratory infections. Here's the last weekly epidemiologic record I'll show you from 2020. This is the Yanomami focus area time series. Dark is bad, hot zone in 2029. And in 2019, areas we suspect with the data that we have where transmission has been interrupted. And so, as they say in Spanish, it's hard, but sí se puede. This is the current focus, or map of the Americas, where the focus in Brazil, the Yanomami area, is no longer all red. Let me summarize what I've talked about. River blindness, onchocerciasis, was introduced into the region of the Americas as part of the Columbian Exchange. The infection originated in Africa. The peculiar distribution of the infection is due to the rarity of neotropical vectors capable of supporting the transmission of this parasite in the New World. It's my theory, a lot of this is my theory, that human encounters with competent vectors were facilitated by Maroons who still harbored ovovolus worms. The nature of maroon life resulted in the establishment of onchocerciasis foci in extremely remote areas, the most extreme being the Amazon. However, as I've shown you, there are other explanations in Mexico and Guatemala. And finally, the AWEPA partnership, which has successfully operated since 1992, is close to eliminating this relic of slavery and the suffering associated with it from the Americas. In 2015, the Pan American Health Organization got everybody together to celebrate the partners. There are lots of partners, but I want to specifically shout out USAID and Merck, WHO, and of course, the successes here are the successes of these 6 countries. And again, to note, President Carter has been with us in this from the beginning to where we are now. And it's been one of the honors of my life to have worked with him. So that's my discussion of Black history and an element of the public health, and I thank you for your attention.
So we can take questions now. Maybe I'll start with the first question. There was earlier today during breakfast, we had a conversation about, well, elimination is not necessarily, there was a discussion earlier saying elimination is not necessarily held by all experts. Say something about the arguments for not having elimination programs. Just address that.
Yeah, sure. So I'll do that very quickly. So you saw the long tail, and you saw me describe how there are no roads in this area, how airplanes, helicopter transport, boats, challenging to get to these areas, not the least to talk about, again, encounters with different cultures. And anthropologists are involved. It's a long story. But that final cost, many will say, is not worth it. The incremental cost of reaching the last case. What I really like about eradication elimination programs is supreme accomplishment, one of the greatest accomplishments you can have in public health. I mean, look at smallpox. Closure, we all in our lives like closure. I'm loving closure in Guatemala, I'm loving it. And equity. Everybody has to be involved, no matter your race, your creed, your age, whether you got money or not, how far away you live or not. To me, I love that concept. But it is very easy to argue against, especially when you get to the very end and people begin to question whether it's worth it. And this may not succeed. That's my quick answer.
Other questions?
Not a lot of questions, so I don't feel bad at taking so long. I use them all the time, sorry.
I think I know the answer. So I was just wanted to know, can the parasite live in any other animal besides human?
Great question, and no.
Okay, that's
It is a human parasite.
So not monkeys?
No. I mean, you can get it in the laboratory into chimpanzees, but it does not last very long. Doesn't like it. The parasite doesn't like it there. So I like to say people get onchocerciasis, but people give onchocerciasis. If people don't have onchocerciasis, there is no onchocerciasis. You have to have people with it, and you have to have a capable vector.
So the reason that it didn't spread in the United States is because there wasn't a good vector?
Yeah, there's
no good vector.
The reason, well, first of all, there are hundreds of species of Simulium. And for a neglected tropical disease like this, nobody's going to test them all, especially if you have to feed them on, either chimpanzees or volunteers who are infected, who are getting harder and harder to find out a capable vector. The answer is slaves that came to the United States had onchocerciasis. They had lymphatic filariasis. Lymphatic filariasis got established in Charleston because those are mosquito-borne diseases, and mosquitoes are a lot more frequent finding than black flies, except in Minnesota perhaps. So, that is the answer, and I think that's the answer for the rest of Brazil, where the biomass of worms that went into Brazil was much greater than went into Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador. Yet, that's where it's found. Would I be very sad, but perhaps not overly surprised if someone discovered somewhere in Brazil there might be some more onco? It could happen. This is, and it's come up a few times when there have been questions, generally driven by places that had the most slaves, where people went in and actually looked serologically to see. I mean, people have looked serologically and haven't found it. So there we have it. That's why it's not an eradication, but it's an elimination program. I like to say we're eliminating everywhere where we know it is, but we're not declaring that we might not be surprised, because life is full of surprises. There's a question here.
Hi. I guess I'm wondering, how did you get community buy-in to take this medication? Just.
It's a great question, and I was very interested in that in 1987 when I went to Guatemala. And I'm very proud, actually, I wrote a series of 3 articles, which I can refer you to. I was the lead author. The first one was approaching communities that hadn't had this medicine before and would they accept it. The second was in the middle of the mass treatment campaign. And the third was after the treatment had stopped and what people were thinking about it. And I'll just say, one thing about that last point, people really miss their ivermectin. And they're not necessarily very happy. Why? Ivermectin kills intestinal worms. Ivermectin kills lice. Ivermectin kills scabies. And so without ivermectin now, their lives, they don't have onco anymore. That's good. But their lives, to them, were better in the day when they could get their treatment annually. But Merck isn't donating it for all these things. So I'm a little sad about that.
Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. I am a health equity scholar, MPH, second year. Do you think, after looking at this disease, that there are any other missed opportunities to see diseases that have perhaps an epidemiological source that reaches further back in history? Are we perhaps missing those older sources in any other diseases?
Well, I was commenting to Ron. My boss, I showed Dr. Hopkins and principles of eradication and elimination, said was not all that interested in this. I told him, I'm giving a lecture, and said, do you have any ideas? And no. But he liked to say, I don't know how it got in the Americas, but I know how to get it out of the Americas. So his focus is, we can, in answer to your question, it's like, it's very academically stimulating and interesting, but the difficulty, especially when you talk about descendants of slavery, there was so little documentation. I mean, I go back to my grandmom, Sally Blount. Her, I know her parents were George and Molly. That's all that I know. What George from Georgia, and so I really think that a lot of what I found in these books and in the research is a lot of stuff people just don't know and maybe never will know. The very interesting bit of, oral history. So much is lost if you lose that oral history, which we've lost a lot of. So I think, I like your question. I'm really interested in in the history and so forth, but I think we're limited in how much we can ever discover, which is why, one person I was working with and talking about this said, oh, this sounds like a chapter. Maybe you should write a chapter. But, you know, a lot you could write and maybe people would say, well, conjecture, conjecture, conjecture. A lot of what I'm saying is conjecture. This sounds like it should be that way.
I think we have time for one more question.
Great. Thank you so much for your lecture. One of your slides, you showed a spectrum, like a continuum of MDA to elimination.
Right.
And a lot of countries happen to be in sub-Saharan Africa towards the beginning. So can you comment more on sort of what are the main reasons you observe for this disparity in terms of progress?
And you might have looked at the bottom if you're a speed reader. They mentioned something that says Loa Loa. Okay, Loa Loa is another worm parasite. This falls into the group of what we call filarial diseases. And you know, there are a number of filarial diseases, the most important to cause elephantiasis and river blindness. But there's another one that doesn't cause much human disease called Loa Loa. And it's transmitted by a deer fly, and it's co-endemic with river blindness in Central Africa. And it's greatly adapted to being in humans. It doesn't cause any particular problem except a worm on occasion crawls across your eye, which doesn't hurt your vision, but it's very annoying, you can imagine. So if you were to give a person who has Loa Loa ivermectin, there's a good chance they could go into a coma because it reaches absolutely spectacular levels of microfilaria in blood, where you can have really, literally 15,000 microfilaria per milliliter of blood. I mean, you look at a blood smear and it's shimmering. And these things are fine, and you're fine, except when you kill them with ivermectin. And then they start sludging in your capillaries, and sludged capillaries in your brain mean you go into a coma. And it's bad. So we really have not figured out good ways to approach treating there. It's only when the benefit outweighs the risks, which means you can't broadly use this in places that have very little onco and no eye disease and skin disease. The risk of this is maybe 1 in 100,000, right? Which is much lower than the murder rate in Honduras, or maybe the murder rate in some cities in the United States. You know, so put it in perspective. But when you treat 1 million people and you're going to kill 10 of them, that's a real problem. And you see treatments are in millions. We're talking in millions. So that is why those countries, good observation, beyond the scope of my talk, but good reason why a lot of these things we can't talk about yet throughout Africa for success.
So thank you so much, Frank. So I guess you'll stick around and mill around for a bit.
I'll be happy to answer any other questions.
I just want to thank everyone for coming out today, and those of you who are online, thank you so much for taking the time. You know, Brown has a lot of stuff going on. You have lots of options of what you could do. Some of you could have just stayed home because schools are out, so you could have taken a break with your kids, but you chose to show up, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for your attention.